Greetings and welcome, or hopefully, welcome back. Thank you for coming. I'm glad you're here. If you wouldn't mind, consider dropping a like and a subscription as a sacrifice to the almighty algorithm. May it forever reign benevolently. Now, on with the story. The Chang Saga by user Hume Reddit, an integral part of the Jenkinsverse by Phillip R Johnson. Chapter 4, The Ox's Plan, Part 1. 1 year, 5 months AV. Ima would never get tired of bringing cubs on their first shuttle ride. Usually such trips were simple outings to the starbase in orbit around Gao, or educational visits to the odd starship. But it was always the ride up into orbit that thrilled the cubs first. They would press their furry faces against the shuttle windows and watch the ground and the clouds shrink below them until the stars suddenly became visible. Then their eyes would aim upward, either at one of Gao's 2 tiny moons, one of the space stations, or the odd starship that waited in orbit. It was rare to see an adult act that way, but by Xu's own admission, she was barely an adult, and her face was pressed so close to the shuttle's window that her tiny nose was bent sideways. Thankfully, the window was transparent crystal matrix, and she didn't have to worry about the human accidentally cracking it, not even with her strength. Ima was happy to see her human sister showing excitement and wonder. She had been badly treated by her introduction to the galaxy and its peoples. After the fateful visit to Furfeg in the city, the mothers had learned what human misery looked like. Xu spent most of the next few days in her nest bed, rarely leaving the dorm, and sometimes skipping meals, even when Ima would scold her for it. Unlike a Gowan, she made no noise. Instead, her eyes watered continuously, and Ima found herself thinking back, trying to remember if she'd ever behaved the same way in the time she'd been with them. Had she been upset and they hadn't recognized it? Myun had barged her way into the sisters' dorm and comforted Xu the way she would any other cub, by cuddling up. Xu seemed to appreciate it, especially when the other cubs of her Taiji group decided Myun had the right idea. Soon their instructor was buried in furry little bodies, chittering and jockeying for space on top of the lone alien, their weight utterly meaningless to a creature that could carry them all simultaneously. It worked, the human making the first of her barking laughs in nearly a 10-day, and finally allowing herself to be dragged to the evening meal, where Yulna all but force-fed her. Ima had reported Xu's improved spirits to Mother Supreme Gyamai, briefly astounded when she pondered the strange circumstances that led to her regularly exchanging holovid calls with arguably the most important being on Gao. It had been nearly half a Gowan year since that meeting, since the human homeworld had been caged behind an immense bubble built from energy and fear. Gao was slowly taking its place within the Dominion, and as Gyamai had promised, the new member was making a nuisance of itself regarding the enclosure of the human world. They demanded specifications on the shield, debated how long it would be in place, and championed the rights and care of any of the humans trapped outside. Father Vian, leader of the Ebony Paw clan and chosen representative to the Galactic Council, had proven to be a particularly cunning member of a clan known for favoring intelligence. He'd begun subtly planting the idea into the heads of other representatives, one by one. If the Governor Agavendrigan Confederacy could trap one species within its star system, what was stopping it from doing it to others? It wasn't enough to get the other members to unify and demand the Confederacy remove the shield, but it kept them from being too celebratory about its use. If Furfeg knew about the trouble Gao was making, about the metaphorical knives being planted in his people's collective backs, he didn't mention it. Instead, his periodic holovid calls to the commune, tense, hostile affairs, as Ima still didn't like him, merely inquired about Xu's health, and how well she was subsisting amongst the Gowans. He seemed concerned and sympathetic, but she often wondered whether he was checking to make sure the human hadn't snapped and started murdering everyone within reach. That was what the fools in the council thought would happen, wasn't it? One day, he called to ask Xu to come to the council and plead for the humans in person, and Ima found herself granting the Governor Agavendrigan some respect, much to her annoyance. It was an offer long overdue, and like any mother, Ima put aside her personal dislike for the big herbivore and helped Xu prepare. She also demanded the right to go along. Though she wasn't inclined towards conspiracies, She'd leave that to the Corti. She didn't trust leaving her friend purely in Furfeg's hands. "Is that the ship?" she breathed, unaware of Ima's many worries. Her gallery had continued to improve, and she was far more intelligible than she had been even just a half a year beforehand. She could still get lost if someone spoke too quickly, and a lot of her word choices were childish, which made sense because the majority of her language lessons had come from Myun. Furfeg had cautioned them not to bother trying to correct that when preparing her for her appearance before the council. Zhu would speak to them in gallery, and though everyone would be hearing through their own respective translators, the devices would hear and interpret the intonation of her words and reflect it in their output, making the human sound very young and innocent, and thus sympathetic. It was further proof to Ima that Furfeg was a manipulator, but she couldn't complain this time since he was using it to Zhu's benefit. She bent down to see through the window Zhu was all but glued to. Above them stretched the Governor Agavendrigan's diplomatic starship, Furfeg's ship. His was a large people, so they built large vessels, hundreds of times the length of their comfortable shuttle. An immense cylinder in space. The ship was tinted in a pleasant light green, its belly bulging as though pregnant with the large transparent greenhouses that supplemented the ship's food and oxygen stores. The ship drifted out of the window towards the front of their shuttle as the pilot altered course towards it. "That's the rich plains, yes," Ima answered. Zhu softly repeated the words under her breath, practicing the name. She glanced back at the Gauian. "I never thought I'd go into space," she said. "On Earth, it's very dangerous. Only the best and bravest go. And here I am, for third time." She shook her head. "My brother would be much happier." "He studies to go into space?" She shook her head again, laughing quietly. "No, he doesn't study at all. Very lazy. Always wants to play. He would annoy you very much." Ima rocked her head back and forth in a Gauian shrug. "Well, he is a male. They can't help it." Zhu laughed again. The shuttle looped up and over the rich plains, swooping down towards the tail end of the ship, which had clamshelled open, exposing the vast shuttle bay. The inside was well lit, and they could see many sapients standing inside, most scurrying around offloading provisions, but a small cadre stood in an open area, including what was obviously a Governor Agavendrigan. "Do they stand in space?" Zhu asked, appalled. Ima chittered lightly. "No, there's a kinetic field. It holds the air inside. In just a moment you will feel it. See?" As they did, a soft tingling washed across their skin as they crossed into the landing bay, floating slowly towards the glowing landing point indicator. The shuttle touched down with barely a thump. The pilot was One Fang clan, and they prided themselves on their skill with ships of all sorts. The side door of the shuttle opened upwards, letting in the air of the starship. Not as antiseptic as Ima had expected, but tingled lightly with the scents of grasses and trees. It was calming, which was probably why the Governor Agavendrigan did it, she thought cynically. The three sapiens who had been waiting advanced as they climbed out of the shuttle. The huge shaggy creature could only be Furfeg, and the Ricka-Chirp-Chirp behind him halted a polite distance away, while the lone Gauian continued forward. "Officer Rigari?" Shu asked, uncertain but hopeful. Her Gauian had lost all accent. The male ducked his head. "Sister Shu, thank you for remembering me." He repeated the gesture again towards Ima. "Mother Ima, welcome aboard." Shu blinked. "Oh, a translator! I'd forgotten all about that. Oh, it's so nice to hear my name properly."
"The entire ship is equipped with translators since it serves as a mobile embassy," Furfeg commented.
Once the Gauian male had made greetings, the other two had moved closer.
"It nearly tripled the cost of the ship, or so I'm told, Miss Chang. Mother Ima,"
he greeted, nodding his immense head towards each of the females. He gestured to the Ricka-Chirp-Chirp behind him.
"This is Captain Master of the ship."
Zhu's eyes went wide. Ima didn't blame her. Even with the help of the translators, Ricka-Chirp-Chirp's names were a mouthful. The tall, slender alien bent its long neck towards them. Ima ducked her head, and Zhu bent her upper body in her people's gesture of respect. Furfeg looked to the lone human.
The journey will take roughly a 10-day, and we'll be setting off soon. Is there anything you needed?
Zhu shrugged. No, I don't think so, anyway. All I have is my clothing, and I brought that with me.
Well, if you think of anything, let one of the stewards know. I've asked them to make the onboard fabricators available for your use. Just tell them what you need. For now, Officer Rigari, would you show our guests to their quarters?
At his assent, the captain and diplomat turned to leave the bay. I thought you were assigned to the Mother Supreme, Ima asked Rigari. I am, but the Mother Supreme has considerable investment in this, and so she asked me to accompany you, both to represent her and to ensure your safety. Ima nodded. Apparently she wasn't the only one to worry about the Dominion taking less care than they should of their human guest. Zhu? She knew she wasn't pronouncing her friend's name correctly, and it was strange to have the translation devices all but pluck the word from her muzzle and correct it. But she liked it. She always felt as though she was slighting the human by calling her Shu, even though it was a limitation of her muzzle, and Zhu never complained. Names were important. The human was looking at the cavernous landing bay and the unflickering expanse of stars beyond the kinetic field. A few of the stars moved, starships taking off from Gao or coming into land. Ima let her have the moment, and Rigari did the same. Handsome, restrained, and sensitive too? The stars were taunting her. After a moment, Zhu's long head fur, held back in its usual braid, rocked back and forth as she shook her head and sighed. Your quarters will have windows, Rigari commented. You can make them as transparent or as opaque as you prefer. Shall I bring you there? The females agreed, reaching into the shuttle for their baggage. Ima only had one bag, but Zhu had 3. Rigari discovered the reason moments later. Here, Sister Shu, can I carry one of... Oof! The Gowan male blinked at the bag, which had stubbornly resisted his attempt to lift it. It would be impolite to chitter, but some of the humor had to show in her voice. Shu's clothes are weighted to compensate for the lighter gravity, she pointed out. 1 set is fine, but 3 is heavy even for me, the human said sheepishly. Rigari stared at them for a moment. I'll get a hover cart. Just a moment. Soon, the 3 were walking through the huge corridors of the ship, sized as they were for Governor Agavendragon. There were actually only about a dozen of the creatures on board, Rigari explained. The majority of the 200 crew were Rikaturkship like the captain, or their bluer, dimmer cousins, the Vizkatik. There were a smattering of other species as well, including nearly 24 Gowans operating in security. Soon, the 2 females were left in their respective neighboring quarters. Ima waited for Rigari to leave before looking around in disapproval. Like everything else on the ship, it was simply too big. The tables and bed had lowered themselves to a comfortable height for a Gowan, but the bed was so large it could have held the entire sisters' dorm back at the commune and left room for the mothers. The Gowan females didn't like to sleep alone. Hadn't Rigari told them that? Unless the gesture was meant for Zhu, she supposed. A bit of privacy after so long immersed in an alien culture, an object of curiosity and concern. Ima wouldn't complain if Zhu was happy with the arrangement. She'd unpacked her lone bag, pulling out her data tablet and recording some holo messages to send back to the commune, letting them know they'd arrived on board safely and warning some of the cubs, and sisters, not to put whipped cream on everything edible. Not long after she'd sent the messages off, the shipboard audio system announced their departure. Through the large crystal window, she saw the stars tilt and begin to move, and before long they stretched out as the huge vessel entered warp. Ima wondered what Zhu thought of the display. She should ask. In fact, it was nearing the time for the end-of-day meal. Would she be interested in eating together? Standing up, she left her tablet on the table and walked down the corridor to the guest quarters next to hers. She didn't think twice about simply entering. They were fellow females, after all. Zhu, would you like to eat? Whoa! Ima squawked as she stepped into Zhu's cabin. The gravity was set much higher than Gao's standard, and the step through the door was like falling down a stair. She flopped to the ground and wheezed as the breath was driven from her lungs. Zhu spun from where she sat, watching the stars through her window. Her eyes went wide as she jumped to her feet. "Oh, Ima! Computer, set gravity to Gao normal! I'm so sorry! Whoop!" The situation played out in reverse as Yu tried to dash over to help a friend. Unfortunately, she was in mid-step when the gravity field changed, so the perfectly reasonable strength she used to move forward suddenly became nearly twice what was needed. The human launched into the air, arms wheeling, and landed with a heavy thud just in front of Ima. Ow? Zhu blinked. Sorry. The steward said the gravity in here could be set to something more like Earth, so I was trying it out. Ima waved a paw. I'm unhurt. I should have expected this. I was just coming over to ask if you wanted to share the end-of-day meal together. I'd like that. The two stared at each other from their respective positions on the floor. We don't have to tell Myeon about this, do we? Zhu finally asked. I won't mention it if you don't. Deal! They decided to eat in Ima's quarters, settling in around the vast table next to each other after placing their orders with the ship's galley. They briefly pondered eating with the other Gowans on board, but Ima didn't feel like putting up with a bunch of males who would likely trip over themselves trying to impress her, and Zhu simply didn't want to be stared at. Zhu left choosing their food to Ima, who was pleased to see a number of Gowan dishes available, and some alien meals she was familiar with and liked. Still feeling a bit spiteful, she made a point of ordering the most expensive and elaborate meals, since Furfeg and the Dominion were footing the bill. It didn't take long at all for a Vizcatic steward to appear at the door, pushing a small hovercart with a pair of trays and a pair of containers holding water and talame, which Ima kept carefully away from the human. The galley had also been warned of their human guest, judging from the small plate of nutrition spheres that were included. Soon, both females had their trays and drinks, and Ima sniffed appreciatively at the fried jalamin fish, a delicacy on Gao she'd only ever experienced once. Steamed vegetables occupied the side, and the flatbread was still warm. Her mouth watered in anticipation. Zhu squinted at Ima's platter. Why does yours look different? The Gowan mother looked at her friend's meal, which should have been identical, her ears flicking back with surprise. Then she scowled. Steward, what in the stars is this? He'd been tapping on his portable data pilot, likely marking off their food as delivered. His long, blue-tinted neck turned his head to Ima at her tone. Pardon, is something wrong? This fish is raw. Did the cook forget something, or do you have a malfunctioning auto-chef? The Vizcatic fidgeted with the data tablet in his hands. We heard the human ate her meat raw. Ima's ears pressed backwards. Where in the galaxy did you hear that? She asked in an appalled voice. Zhu rubbed her temples. Not even on my own planet, and people are still mistaking me for Japanese. Ima didn't know what Japanese was, but she'd ask later. She glared at the steward. As far as she was concerned, this was merely the latest in a number of slights the humans had to deal with from a galactic society that seemed to want to believe them to be savages. She put the cover back on Zhu's meal and pushed it back across the table. Obviously, your information is incorrect. Take this back and have the cook prepare it properly. The steward bobbed his head, stammering apologies and all but fleeing the guest quarters, pushing the hovercart ahead of him. Ima growled quietly. Zhu was looking at her wide-eyed. Wow, I don't even have the nerve to ask for extra sauce at Swiss Chalet. I'll ask you what that is later. For now, here, we'll split this plate. And when that dimwit comes back, we'll split that one too. Okay, mind if I dip my nutrition spheres in that sauce? One day done, one battle fought. To Ima's quiet relief, Zhu asked to sleep in the room with her. She'd gotten used to the dorm at the commune, and the strange quiet of her quarters was jarring. The next morning she raved about the shower, though she was somewhat disgruntled to learn that it had been included for the sake of the Corti. They settled in for the journey, trying to avoid boredom. Zhu practiced and revised her speech to the council. Ima reviewed her lesson plans for the cubs. Regari would sometimes drop by to check up on them, and afterwards, Zhu would always give her a smug, knowing look if Ima's eyes lingered a bit too long when the guard left. Oddly, Furfeg made no visits, though perhaps he was busy arranging things in his shipboard office. It was late in the evening of the third day of their journey. Zhu had taken advantage of Furfeg's offer and asked the fabricators to make her some more clothing. At Ima's encouragement, again to soak Furfeg in the Dominion as much as possible, a nervous Ruher had taken her specifications and returned with several variations of long, loose clothing of strong and smooth fabric. The cloth shimmered a rich red in the light and had been trimmed with gold threading, and when Ima asked her about the design, she simply explained that it had derived from her native culture on her homeworld, a more elaborate version of the clothing associated with Gung Fu. The Ruher seemed surprised by the praise Zhu heaped upon her, as if she had expected the human to ignore or dismiss her efforts. It was not a reaction that went unnoticed by the Gowan mother. Ima watched Zhu admire herself in the mirror. The new clothing did look quite fetching, she thought, although a furred species would likely find the weight of the cloth on their shoulders maddening. She was happy with her overalls, although she was pondering asking for some more made from the same fabric. Suddenly, the deck became the ceiling, and both females were launched into the air. Zhu cried out, and Ima screeched. She could hear the metal bones of the rich planes groaning, and through the windows the star spun. She was suddenly very appreciative of the huge bed when it caught her as the gravity fields reversed again. Zhu wasn't so lucky, crashing against the table which buckled under the human's weight, sending her sliding off to roll onto the floor. A low, pulsing tone rang through the ship, the audible alert. The communication panel next to the door had turned mauve, the galactic standard color of distress. Ow! What was that? Zhu asked nervously as she climbed to her feet. Ima, are you okay? I'm fine, she replied. You? I'm okay. What happened? Possibly just an engine failure, Ima replied. It happens rarely. We're tumbling. Give it a moment. The helm officer will correct. She lost the ability to speak. She hadn't wanted to think about it, hadn't wanted to compare the sudden stop of the rich plains to the only other time she'd felt a starship get torn out of warp, when Trigg's mercenaries had hijacked the ill-fated colonial ship Winter Coat. But as the stars slowed in their nausea-inducing spinning out the window and a wide, predatory-looking ship came into view, she found her experience terrifyingly accurate. Oh, no. What? What is it? Who are they? Zhu asked, and Ima could hear the fear in her voice. She looked over at her sister, her ears folded against her skull. Hunters. Pleasure. Accomplishment.
Alpha, the prey vessel has been caught by the grav spike. The projection of its trajectory between the Furface world and the prey meeting station was accurate.
The Alpha looked over at the Beta as it stood to give its report. In theory, it didn't need to stand. In fact, it could have spoken to the Alpha from anywhere on the ship with but a thought. Still, it was good for its subordinates to clamor for its favor. Acknowledgement. Approval.
Very well. The trap was well made. You may have the second taste of the hunt.
The Beta broadcast its pleasure wordlessly over the cybernetic network that connected all of the hunters on the vessel. Theirs was a large pack, 30 strong, and the appetite of so many hunters was great, as was their ambition. A large pack meant large prey, and the herbivore vessel they'd caught was large indeed. The Alpha had a particular fondness for the meat of the large, shaggy herbivore prey. There was so much of it, and the creatures were terrified when isolated, which sweetened their meat exquisitely. The Alpha ground its multiple rows of teeth in anticipation, eager for the first bite. But first, the harvest. Excitement, command.
Take us in. Prepare for breach. Meat to the maw.
Regari was reaching for his pulse rifle almost before Rich Plains had finished tumbling. It was possible it was a simple engine failure, one that would be embarrassing for the captain, requiring a day or two of repair before the ship could be underway again. But Regari was not assigned to the ship to deal with incidents which were merely embarrassing. He'd been sitting at his desk in his quarters, filling out reports on his tablet, when the gravity went wild. He was lifted out of his seat, his legs bumping against the table and giving him just enough time to grab hold of it, his claws automatically unsheathing to grant him more purchase. Then the ship had leveled out, hurling him to the deck. He scrambled to his feet, pulling breath in through bruised ribs. His quarters had no windows, so he grabbed his rifle from the storage rack and stormed out into the corridor. The crew of the ship scrambled around him, roused from what they thought would be easy third and fourth shifts. Regari didn't know the expressions of aliens well, but he was certain there was more than alarm on the faces of the Vizcatic and Rikaturk ship who had dashed past him. There was fear. Fortunately, there was a Gowan amongst them, a young One-Fang, possibly the shuttle pilot who had delivered the females. "Brother," Regari grabbed hold of the boy before he could dash by. "Brother, what happened?" The young male ducked his head. "We've been torn out of warp, brother." He resisted the urge to snap that was plainly obvious. The youngster looked on the edge as it was. "Torn? Not an engine malfunction? Who attacked us?" The One-Fang's ears were flat against his skull. "Hunters, brother." Regari felt his heart go cold, then clenched his teeth, discarding the reaction as useless. "Go to the armory, fetch yourself a weapon and as many of the portable kinetic barriers as you can. Bring as many of the brothers as you come across, and meet me at the landing bay." "The bay?" the young male blinked. "Are we evacuating?" The set of Regari's muzzle was grim. "No, that's the most likely place the hunters will breach the hull. Bring your brothers and be ready to fight." "Hunters? That's a hunter ship?" Zhu asked, her voice timid. They'd watched as the big hunter vessel, not a swarm ship, but larger than a standard pack ship, thrusted towards the disabled diplomatic ship. The hunter ship was wide and flat, with thrusters on the back and a breaching tube mounted on the front like a grotesque proboscis. When the big Governor Agavendrigan ship had shaken, Ima had known that the tube was now piercing the hull, and the hunters were invading. "Ima, what do we do?" Zhu demanded. The Gowan mother looked at her friend, more frightened than when the Wintercoat had been hijacked and the mercenaries had begun murdering her crew. "There's nothing we can do. The security forces will fight them. We just need to wait." She didn't want to think about how even a normal pack ship was more than a match for the Rich Plains' sparse crew. Her doubts must have shown, because Zhu looked down at her hands, which had clenched into fists. She glanced back up at the other female. "I have to help." Ima's muzzle dropped open. "Zhu, no. You did well against the Locale and the Mirnaherm, but these are hunters. Every race is terrified of them, for good reason." "Then that means they need my help even more. Ima, She blinked, struggling for words. "I'll be back, okay? Stay safe." "Zhu!" Ima grabbed at her arm, but she might as well have been trying to hold back a starship. Zhu dashed out into the corridor, her braids snapped back and forth as her head turned to note which direction almost all of the crew were running. And then she ran in the opposite. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I am your host, the Casual Deathworlder, and this has been the Zhu Chang Saga, Chapter 4, Part 1. I hope you enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed bringing it to you. If you enjoyed it, please give that like button a little love and maybe consider subscribing if you haven't already. It always helps the algorithm. As always, a huge shout out to my editor, Gregor. Thank you very much, buddy. Also, another shout out to the author himself. Thank you for your permission, Hambone. Okay, this has been part 1 of what I think will probably be 3. I just need to figure out good places for stopping. Okay, this chapter is getting good. From the Deathworlders, if you remember from the very beginning, the hunters had their ass handed to them from a middle-aged bartender from the middle of, in his own words, bumfuck nowhere. How well do you think they're gonna handle a 20-year-old who speaks fluent kung fu? This is gonna be exciting. I can hardly wait. Okay, question, who's got the question? So, what's your favorite color? Mine is blue. I actually prefer electric blue, but I saw a new one today. It's actually called Galactica Blue. And oh my goodness, I'm in love with it. So, leave your answers in the comments down below. In the meantime, take care, be safe. I love you all. Bye-bye. Test, test, this is a test. This is only a test.